First, we start by removing the cover. There's 16 screws located on the top of the unit, hidden between the fins of the heat sinks. Go ahead and use a 7/64 Allen driver and get these removed. Sometimes they can be a little difficult to get out, so you can go ahead and use a pair of tweezers once you have them loosened, and you can pull them out that way. Once you have all the screws removed, you're going to go ahead and reach up on the back of the unit and push. This may require a little bit of force. Sometimes this can be a little difficult because it'll stick to the thermal interface underneath the lid. Then you're going to flip the unit onto its side. Usually I like to stick a pad underneath the one of the heat sinks and then flip it onto the pad. And then there's 8 screws located along the bottom of each side with the heat sinks. Go ahead and remove those using a 7/64 Allen driver. Once you get all the screws out of the bottom of the unit, you're just going to roll it back onto its feet and set it back in your workspace. Next step, we're going to remove the 4 screws located in the top of the product on both sides there. And this is going to free up the heat sinks so we can remove them. Removing the heat sinks can be a little bit tricky, but if you slide it backwards and disconnect the top connector, you should be able to reach in with one hand and undo the large Molex connector on the inside of the board. There should be 2 release tabs on either side of it. You just gently squeeze them and you'll feel it disconnect as you pull away from it. Once you have this connector released, you can go ahead and remove both of the sideboards and go ahead and set them aside for now. Next step is removing the top board. We're going to start by removing the 4 Phillips screws located on the jack panel. There's 2 located next to each of the XLR connectors. If this is a mono version, you'll only have 1 XLR connector, so 2 screws. Once you have those screws out, there's 4 7/64 Allen heads along the top edge of the product. You're going to want to remove 3 of them. Leave the 3rd one in place until you can brace the top board so that it doesn't hang on the connectors. And then once you brace it with your hand, go ahead and remove that last screw, and then you should be able to just gently pull it out. Once you get it removed, there should be a 4-pin cable connection on the right-hand side of the product, and there should be a small little Molex ribbon cable that you can unplug on the other side. Once you have this board out, if you need to at this point, or if you have any desire to, you can replace the lugs on your product or swap them out simply by removing the 4 screws on the jack panel. And then you have access to solder new lugs or make new connections on your jack panel. And then once you get that done, you can go ahead and just reinstall it the same way you pulled it out using the same 4 screws. Next, we're going to work on removing the AC board from our product. There's 3 cable connections, 1 large Molex down near the bottom, and then there's 2 ribbon cables that you can just gently unplug. And after we get those removed, there's 5 screws that you can go ahead and remove with a number 1 Phillips driver located around the edge of the board. Once you get these 5 board screws removed, go ahead and use a flathead or a 1/4 inch socket driver, and you can go ahead and remove the 1 screw that's holding the ground wire in place there. Once you have the ground screw removed, there's only 2 more screws located on the jack panel that you need to remove. Go ahead and use a number 2 Phillips driver to remove those 2 screws. Once you have the screws out, you can go ahead and remove the board and replace it if necessary. Putting it back in is just as easy as taking it out. Go ahead and start placing it and make sure you get the connectors through the jack panel. And then you're going to start by replacing those 2 screws on the AC connector on the jack panel. And then you're going to replace all the PCB screws that you took off, the 5 that are around the edge of the board. Once you finish getting the board screws in, go ahead and grab that last screw for the ground wire and tighten it down thoroughly, making sure that the ring kind of bites into the base metal and gets a good connection for the ground wire. While we have the chassis open like this, it is easy to replace your caps if you need to. Pretty simple, you just go ahead and loosen the 2 screws located around the clamps at the base of the caps. And then there's 4 large Phillips screws that you need to remove from the bus bars on top. Once you get these guys out, you can go ahead and push the bus bar out of the way, and the cap should just gently slide out from the top of the clamp down below. When reinstalling your caps, be sure that you pay attention to the polarity marked on the bus bar. You want to make sure that you have it connected right to the proper terminals on your large caps. Push the bus bar back down over the top of the caps and reinstall those 4 screws located on top that you removed earlier. Once you have the 4 screws secured on top of the bus bar there, go ahead and push down on the entire assembly and make sure it's firmly pushed into your base metal. And then you're going to tighten the 2 clamp screws located at the base of the caps. Don't tighten these too tight. As shown, you can see that there's a slight gap in the connector. If you go to tighten this completely and squeeze up that gap, you can dent and damage your capacitors, and you really don't want to do that. If you need to access the front control board, this is the easiest time to do it. Go ahead and slide the product to the front of an edge of a table, and then underneath along the front edge there's going to be 4 7/64 screws that you can remove. Once you get these 4 screws out, you can go ahead and lift the faceplate away and disconnect the ribbon cable located at the back. To remove the front control board from the faceplate, there's going to be 8 number 1 Phillips screws that you need to remove. Once you get these off, you can go ahead and pull the front control board from the unit. The front control board goes right back in the same way it came out. Go ahead and place it in the cavity where it goes, and then reinstall the 8 screws that you removed earlier. To reinstall the faceplate back onto the base metal, start by making the ribbon cable connection located on the back of the circuit board, and then guide the 3 switches at the bottom of the product into the 3 holes located on the base metal, making sure that you can't damage these. They're very delicate, and just a little bit of movement can damage the switch. Once you get everything lined up and put in place, go ahead and reinstall the 4 screws located along the bottom edge of the unit. It's usually best to start these just a little bit to get them all in place and then tighten them all up once you get them all started. If you need to remove your output board or your sideboard from your heatsink, there's 2 screws that you need to start with on the back edge of the heatsink located between the heatsink fins. There's a 3rd one on each one that's not actually going into the board. You can go ahead and leave that one behind. It's just there for aesthetic purposes. Once you get those 2 screws, you can go ahead and lay the heatsink down, and there's 6 more located on the edges and corners of the output board itself. Go ahead and remove these guys, and then the output board should be able to come off. If you're having trouble removing the output board from the heatsink, it can get kind of stuck due to the thermal paste on the back edge of the board. It's easiest if you slide it upwards until you can get a nice grip underneath one of the corners, and then you can get some leverage against it and pull up on it. Replacing your sideboard, first check that there's an adequate amount of thermal paste located between the board and the heatsink. If you need to, go ahead and apply more. Once you're ready to reinstall your sideboard, go ahead and start the 6 screws located around the edge of the board, but don't tighten any of them down. Once you get these 6 screws in place, go ahead and pull the board back towards the closest edge of the heatsink and make it flush with the top edge of the heatsink face. Once you do this, go ahead and tighten down that corner screw. Go ahead and tighten down the other corner screw while making sure that it's flush also with the top edge of the heatsink. Once you get these 2 screws tightened and in place, go ahead and tighten down the rest of your screws. Once you have the board mounted to the heatsink, go ahead and flip it up and reinstall the 2 screws in between the heatsink fins on the outside edge of the heatsink. Before we start reinstalling the boards onto our base metal, we have to reinstall the cables and connections first that we unplugged earlier when removing the AC board. Go ahead and plug back in your 2 ribbon cables and reconnect your Molex connector on the bottom edge of the board there. Before we reinstall any boards, we have to prepare the top board by pulling out the XLR tabs. When you're doing this, the rings around the XLR connectors will pull out and off of the product. Go ahead and pull out the XLR tab and reinstall the ring, paying attention to the 2 pins on the back of the ring and also the cutout, making sure that it's facing the top edge of the XLR tab. First thing to do when reinstalling the top board is reconnect that 4-pin connector that you unplugged earlier, located along the front edge of the board. Once you get that installed, you can go ahead and place the board. Once you get this in place, go ahead and install one of the screws along the top edge to hold the board in place. Go ahead and reinstall the 4 screws on either side of the XLR connections on the back of the jack panel. Then reinsert your XLR tabs. Be very careful about this and make sure that you get them nice and straight when you're putting them in. If you get them at all crooked and they get stuck, they can be really painful to try and remove. The last step for the top board is to reach around the side of the jack panel and reconnect the ribbon cable that you unplugged when removing it earlier. Next step is to reinstall the output boards and heat sinks on the side of your amplifier. There's 2 major things you have to pay attention to when you're putting these boards on. There's the connector located on the edge of the top board that has to mate with the connector on the top of the sideboard. If this doesn't go together straight, you can damage the pins inside the connector. Before you worry about this connection, first install your large Molex connection to the sideboard and make sure you hear the firm click from both sides of the connector. And then once you have this connection done in the center of the board, you can pay attention to the connection to make on the top edge of the board as you guide the heatsink into place. Once you have the one heatsink on, go ahead and reinstall the 2 screws along the top edge to hold it in place. It's easiest to start with the back one and push it all the way in as far as it can go, tighten it down, and then go to the front edge and push the front of the heatsink in towards the product until the gap along the front edge of the board goes away, and then tighten down that front screw. Reinstalling the other heatsink is exactly the same way. First, connect the large Molex connector and make sure you hear it click into place, and then watch that top connector and gently guide it into the socket that it needs to go into on the top edge of that board. Then you're going to reinstall the top 2 screws. Go ahead and start with the back one and push firmly against the unit. And then once you have the back one tightened down, do the front one by gently pushing on the front edge of the heatsink until the gap goes away between the top board and the edge of the heatsink. Once you have the top screws installed in the heatsink, go ahead and flip the product onto its side and reinstall the 8 screws located along the bottom edges of each heatsink. It's easiest to get these guys started and not tightened. Sometimes the heatsink needs to be adjusted to line up the holes. And once you get them all started, go ahead and tighten them all down, starting from the back to the front edge. Once you have these screws installed, go ahead and put the unit back onto its feet. The next step is reinstalling the cover. Use the front edge to guide the cover into place. And once you have the cover down, you're gonna go ahead and line it up as best you can. Push it back towards the jack panel, but also make sure that the gap around the heatsink and top edge is all nice and uniform and exactly how you want it. Once you find the sweet spot where you want it, go ahead and first tighten down the 4 screws located on the inside edge of each of the heat sinks in the back. Once you have those ones tightened down, then you're going to do the ones on the outside edge of the heat sinks located on the edges of the product. The last step to finish your amplifier is installing the 2 front screws holding the faceplate to the top cover. You're going to start by getting these both set in place and then squeeze with your hand against the top cover until the gap that's in the faceplate is as uniform as it is on the side heat sinks, and then tighten these both down.